The day Maggie Hawthorne arrived in Dry Creek, Texas, with nothing but a battered carpetbag, a deed to 40 acres of sun-cracked earth, and a jaw set hard enough to split stone, the men on the porch of Hollis's general store stopped talking and simply stared. It was the spring of 1874, and the land out west of the Pecos had a way of breaking people before it ever offered them anything in return. The sky was the kind of blue that looked painted on, too vivid, too wide, pressing down on the mesa tops and rolling grasslands like a judgment. Dust moved in slow curtains across the road. A horse tied to the post outside the store flicked its tail at flies that did not care about being flicked at. Everything about Dry Creek announced itself as difficult, as old and worn and unbothered by newcomers, and Maggie walked into the center of it like she had been born walking into difficult places. She was 24 years old, with dark copper hair that had come loose from its pins somewhere between Abilene and here, and green eyes that cataloged everything around her with a calm, steady intelligence that made people instinctively understand. She was not going to be talked out of anything she had already decided. She wore a plain brown traveling dress that had seen better years and boots that were good quality but trail-beaten. She carried herself straight, shoulders square, chin up, not because she was trying to look fearless but because fear, in Maggie Hawthorne's experience, was best kept inside where it could not be used against you. The deed in her carpetbag had come from her uncle, Clement Hawthorne, who had died that past November owing debts to 3 different men, and leaving exactly 2 things behind him: a letter full of apologies, and the deed to a piece of West Texas hardpan that he had never once set foot on in the 6 years he had owned it. Maggie had spent the winter in Fort Worth reading everything she could find about dryland farming, about irrigation, about grass crops and soil amendments, working evenings at a seamstress shop to save enough for the journey and the first season's supplies. She had arrived, as she had planned, before the worst of the summer heat, and she intended to make something of that land, or she intended to be buried under it. Those were the only 2 options she had given herself. She did not know, when she stepped up onto the porch to ask directions to the county land office, that the man leaning against the far post with his hat tipped low and a piece of grass stem between his teeth was about to become the most important person in her life. Clark Shelby was 28 years old and had been ranching the 40 acres adjacent to her uncle's parcel for 3 years, ever since he had come home from a cattle drive to San Antonio with enough saved wages to put a down payment on the land he had been staring at since he was a boy working his father's spread 20 miles south. He was a tall man, lean from hard work rather than lack of food, with dark eyes that were serious in the way that quiet people's eyes often are, holding things they do not say out loud. He had a straight nose, a jaw that had taken some sun, and hands that were scarred in the small ways that spoke of a life spent around rope and wire and wood. He was not a man who talked much in groups, but he was known around Dry Creek as someone whose word meant something, which in 1874 in West Texas was among the highest compliments a person could earn. He watched her come up the steps with a kind of frank attention that he did not bother to hide, because he was not a man who hid things. "Excuse me," she said to the group in general, not looking at any one man in particular, which he noticed immediately. Most women who came west and found themselves outnumbered picked a face to direct themselves at. She directed herself at the air between them all, as if none of them had any special authority over the information she was seeking. "Can any of you tell me where the county land office is?" One of the men, Burl Pickens, who ran the feed store and considered himself something of a wit, tilted his hat back. "Land office is down on Mesa Street, ma'am. You buying or selling?" "Registering a deed," she said. "My name is Maggie Hawthorne. I own the Clement Hawthorne parcel west of town." There was a small silence. Clark straightened almost imperceptibly from his lean against the post. "Hawthorne land," said old Reuben Gates from his chair by the door. "That's hard country out there, miss. That parcel ain't been worked. Ground's dry as a sermon." "Then I will give it water," Maggie said pleasantly, and went back down the steps toward Mesa Street. Clark watched her go. He watched the straight line of her back, and the way the dust moved around her feet, and the particular set of her shoulders, which said everything and said none of it apologetically. He dropped the grass stem from his teeth into the dirt. "Well," said Burl Pickens. "Indeed," said Reuben Gates. Clark said nothing. He had already picked up his hat from the post beside him and was following at a distance that could have been described as coincidental, except that nothing Clark Shelby did was coincidental. He did not follow her into the land office. He stood across the dusty street and looked at the sky for a while, thinking about things that were really one thing. And then he went to the hardware store and bought the fence wire he had come to town for in the first place, and rode back out to his land. That evening, from his porch, he could see the distant flicker of a cook fire on the Hawthorne parcel, just a small orange point in the enormous dark, and he looked at it for longer than he intended to. She had set up a canvas tent near the creek bed, which in spring carried a thin thread of water that she had every intention of understanding completely before the dry months came. She had a cook fire, a cast iron pot, a bag of cornmeal, a side of cured pork, and a notebook in which she had already begun sketching the layout of the land she had walked that afternoon. The creek bed ran roughly east to west. The flattest portion of the parcel was to the north and received good morning sun. There were mesquite trees along the southern edge that would provide some wind shelter. The soil, when she dug her fingers into it, was hard-packed but not hopeless. There was clay underneath that held moisture if managed correctly. She had read about this. She had spent a winter reading about exactly this. She wrote in her notebook by firelight until the fire burned low, and then she wrapped herself in a wool blanket and slept in the tent with the peculiar soundness of someone who has made a decision so completely that no part of them is second-guessing it. She met Clark Shelby properly the next morning. She was walking the fence line between their two parcels, noting where the posts were sunk and where the wire had sagged, when she heard a horse and turned to find a rider coming along the line from the east, moving at an easy walk. He was the man from the porch she recognized immediately. Dark eyes, serious, hat brim shading most of his face. He pulled up his horse a few yards from her and raised 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, shielding her eyes from the sun to look up at him. "Clark Shelby," he said. "I run the adjacent parcel east of yours." "Maggie Hawthorne," she said, though of course he knew that already. "I was just looking at your fence line." "I know it needs work on the west end," he said without defensiveness. "I've been meaning to get to it. Your uncle and I had an agreement about splitting the maintenance. I wasn't sure if that carried." She looked at him with those calm green eyes, and he had the feeling again, the one from the day before, that she was reading something in the air just past him. "It carries," she said. "I don't see any reason it shouldn't. A fence line maintained on both sides is half the work for both of us. That seems reasonable." He nodded slowly. "You planning to farm this land?" "I am." He took a moment with that. Not a dismissive moment, she noticed. Not the kind of pause that was really a man arranging his face before he told a woman something was impossible. It was a genuine considering pause. "What crop?" "Sorghum to start," she said. "It's drought tolerant. I want to get the soil amendment started this season and put in a proper sorghum crop in the fall. And I want to dig out the creek bed where it narrows and build a small retention pool. There's enough spring water flow to feed it if I work with the grade right." He looked at her for a long, quiet beat. Then he looked out at the land, the way it lay, the way the creek bed moved. "You've studied it," he said. "All winter," she said. Something shifted in his expression then. Not surprise exactly. More like a door opening onto a view he had not known was there. "I know this land pretty well," he said. "My property runs along yours for about a quarter mile. I've watched the water table out here for 3 years. He paused. "The narrowest part of that creek bed where it turns south, that's where I dig the retention pool. The grade drops right there, and the clay shelf underneath will hold the water if you line the edges with flat rock." Maggie looked at him steadily. "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said. He got down from his horse. It was a simple movement, not performed. Just a man getting down off a horse because a conversation had taken a turn that deserved two people standing on the same ground to have it properly. He walked to where she stood, and they both looked out at the creek bed. And he told her what he knew about the water table, and she told him what she had read, and between them they arrived, in about 20 minutes, at a plan that was better than either plan had been separately. When she walked back toward her tent to get her notebook and write it down, he fell into step beside her without being invited and without being obtrusive, and she did not ask him to leave because it did not occur to her to want him to. That was how it started, and how it started was in some ways a complete picture of how everything else went. Through April and into May, they worked their respective lands during the days and found themselves at the fence line between their parcels at the end of them. Not by arrangement at first, just by the coincidence that the fence line ran past the place where she was doing her soil work and the place where he was mending the wire. And coincidences have a way of becoming expectations without anybody declaring them so. They would stand at the fence as the sun went long and orange across the flatlands and talk about water and soil, and the price of seed in town, and the behavior of the weather that season, and then go their separate ways to eat their separate suppers and sleep under their separate roofs. She had raised a small structure by then. Not much, just a one-room building with a wood plank floor and a tin roof that she and a Mexican carpenter named Ignacio, who she had hired for 2 weeks from town, had built together. Ignacio had been skeptical at first about working for a woman alone, and then he had watched her work for half a morning, and his skepticism had converted itself into respect, which he expressed in the straightforward way of a man who is not complicated about his feelings, by working twice as hard as she was paying him for. Clark noticed the building going up from his property and did not comment on it for 4 days, which was the amount of time it took him to arrive at the fence line one evening and say, with his characteristic directness, "That roof is going to leak where the tin overlaps over the east corner. The angle's off." "I know," she said. "I'm going to seal it with pine pitch." "That'll work," he said. Then, after a pause, "I have some pine pitch at the house." She looked at him. "Are you offering or informing?" "Both," he said. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. It was the kind of almost that people who are paying attention remember. He brought the pine pitch the next morning and they sealed the roof together, him on the ladder and her passing things up, and then her on the ladder and him passing things up, because she saw no reason for one person to hold the ladder the entire time when 2 people could each do half the high work, and he raised no objection to this arrangement because he had no objection to it. That was something she was beginning to understand about Clark Shelby. He did not perform equality, he simply had it. She would pick up a shovel and start digging, and he would pick up a shovel and dig beside her without any conversation about who ought to be doing what. He treated her competence like a fact, the way you treat gravity or weather, not remarkable because it simply was. It was remarkable to Maggie because she had not had it treated that way before. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who made soap and mended things, and she had been educated beyond what most people thought necessary for a girl, which had made her life both richer and more difficult by turns. The richness came from knowing things, from having opinions that were backed by knowledge and the language to express them. The difficulty came from the number of people who did not find this attractive in a woman, which she had catalogued steadily from age 15 onward. She had been courted twice, and both times found herself in the company of men who wanted her to be quieter, smarter in private, less inclined to tell them when they were wrong. She had a theory about herself, privately held, which was that she would either find a man who did not need her diminished in order to feel large himself, or she would not find one at all, and she had made her peace with both possibilities. She had not made her peace easily or completely, but she had made it. She had not anticipated Clark Shelby. He began helping her with the retention pool in early May. He had his own work, his cattle and his fence line and his hay crop coming in, but he gave her 2 mornings a week and they dug together, both of them in the creek bed with shovels, both of them covered in red clay dust by midday, both of them hauling flat limestone rocks from the southern edge of her property to line the basin they were creating. The work was hard and they were mostly quiet while they did it. But the quiet between them was not empty. It had a texture to it, a shared attention to the task, a kind of comfortable awareness of the other person's movements and rhythms that develops between people who work together honestly. One afternoon in mid-May, she hit a buried rock shelf that neither of them had expected, and the shovel handle cracked against it and sent a jolt up through her arms. She said a word that she would not have said in company, and he looked up from where he was working 6 feet away, and she saw him struggle not to laugh. "Go ahead," she said. He laughed, and it transformed his face entirely. It was not a polite laugh. It was a real one, a startled, delighted one, and it lasted about 3 seconds before he put it back where he kept things. But those 3 seconds were the first time she looked at Clark Shelby and felt something that was not simply admiration or appreciation for a practical man. She looked back at her cracked shovel handle and felt warm in a way that was not attributable to the May sun. "I've got a spare handle at the house," he said, getting himself back under control. "I know you have a spare everything at the house," she said. "How many years of supplies do you have in that barn?" "Enough," he said, which made her laugh, and he watched her laugh with the same attention he gave to everything, quiet and serious and entirely present. He brought the spare handle that evening when he came to the fence line, and she fitted it while they talked about the creek project and whether the spring rains had deposited enough silt at the basin point to warrant a deeper dig before they lined it with rock. She worked on the shovel while she talked, one knee on the ground, the other foot planted, mallet tapping the new handle into the socket, and he leaned on the fence post watching her and answering her questions about the watershed and not once suggesting she hand the shovel to him to fix, because it did not occur to him to suggest it. She could see that clearly, could see that the thought was genuinely not there, and she found that she had to look down at her work for a moment to collect herself. "Clark," she said, "yeah. Why did you help me with the retention pool?" He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was long and golden across the grass. "Because you were doing it right," he said finally, "and because it's good for the water table on both parcels, and because," he paused, seeming to decide something, "you didn't ask me to stop when I showed up." She looked up from the shovel. He was looking at the horizon, which she was beginning to understand was where he looked when he was saying something he was not entirely comfortable saying. "That last reason is the real one, isn't it?" she said. He turned and looked at her directly. "Probably," he said. She held his gaze. "I'm glad you came," she said. He nodded once, just slightly, as if that settled something. They both looked at the horizon for a while. A meadowlark called somewhere in the grass, one clear rising note, and then silence. The retention pool was completed by the end of May, and it was a good piece of work. The clay basin lined with flat limestone, the creek bed redirected with a simple earthen dam at the narrow point, a trough dug to the east to allow overflow to drain without flooding. The first time the spring rains filled it, Maggie stood at the edge of it in the early morning and watched the water pool and still in the basin, reflecting the sky, and felt something so fierce and proud move through her that it came out of her eyes before she could stop it. She wiped at her face quickly and turned around to find Clark standing 10 feet behind her, hat in his hands. She had not heard him come. He looked at the full basin and then at her face, which was still flushed from the quickly wiped emotion, and he did not remark on it, and he did not look away from it either. "You built that," he said quietly. "We built that," she said. He shook his head just slightly. "No, I mean I helped. But that was your plan, your dig, your vision for this land." He put his hat back on. "You built that, Maggie." She had been called Miss Hawthorne or ma'am by everyone in Dry Creek since she arrived. The sound of her given name in his voice was a particular kind of quiet, the way something sounds when it's being handled with care. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not apologize for that. June arrived with its hammer heat, and Maggie planted her soil amendments, working in wood ash and animal compost she had been collecting through the spring, turning the northern flat with a rented plow horse that she drove herself on days that started before the sun cleared the mesa. Clark watched from his fence line and did not offer to drive the plow for her. When the horse needed reshoeing in the second week of June, he drove her to the farrier in Dry Creek, which was practical because his horse needed looking at too, and on the way back they sat side by side on the wagon bench in the long evening and talked the whole 20 miles about farming and Texas and books they had each read and things they believed. He had grown up educated too, she discovered, a fact that surprised some people and did not surprise her at all. His father had been a teacher before he became a rancher, and Clark had read widely in the way of people who are curious about everything and have learned from reading because they like it rather than because they were required to. He had opinions about irrigation engineering that he had formed from reading about the Spanish missions in California. He had thoughts about land rights and cattle law that were informed and unromantic. He talked about these things with the same economy of words he applied to everything, but when she pushed back on something, he did not retreat into vagueness. He engaged with her argument and either countered it or conceded it based entirely on whether he thought she was right. She pushed back on his views about the cattle industry's future in the Pecos region because she thought he was underestimating the effect of the railroad expansion on beef prices, and he listened to her argument with full attention and then said, "You're right about the railroad. I was thinking too locally." She felt the full weight of those words like something physical. She was right. He had been thinking too locally, stated as fact without qualification. She thought about that all the way home and for some time after. They sat together on the bench in the easy dark of late evening while the horse pulled them the last few miles, and neither of them spoke much after the conversation about cattle economics, but the silence had changed. It was the silence of two people who have said real things and are now comfortable inside the reality they have arrived at together. He left her at her door, such as it was, and rode back to his own place, and she stood outside her small house in the dark for a while, looking at the stars and the enormous Texas sky, and finally went inside and lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, feeling warm and unsettled and more alive than she had in a long time. She did not allow herself to make much of any of it in her own mind. She was here to build something. She was not here looking for a man. And there were a great many ways that falling in love with a neighbor could complicate the practical arrangement they had, which served them both well. She had been careful with herself her whole life, not cold, but deliberate, and she intended to remain so. She lasted about 3 more weeks before she stopped being able to pretend the feeling was anything other than what it was. What broke it was the afternoon in late June when she went over to his property to return a borrowed bucket and found him in the corral working with a young horse that had gone spooked and difficult, speaking to it in a low, steady voice, while the horse circled him on a long line, and she stood at the corral fence and watched him for 15 minutes without him knowing she was there. Watched how patient he was. Watched how he read the animal's smallest signals and adjusted his own body language accordingly, how he never pushed harder than the horse could accept, how when the horse finally came close enough to lip at his outstretched hand, he stood completely still and let the animal make that decision entirely on its own terms. She had never in her life wanted to put her hand against a man's face as badly as she did in that moment. She set the bucket down beside the fence post and walked home before he could turn around, and she sat in her house and had an honest conversation with herself that she had been half avoiding for 2 months, and when it was over she knew 3 things. She knew she was in love with Clark Shelby. She knew she was not going to pretend otherwise, because she was not built for pretending, and she knew that she was terrified in the precise way that a person is terrified when something matters enormously and the outcome is uncertain. She picked up her notebook and worked on her irrigation plan for the rest of the afternoon until the fear had been noted and cataloged and set in its proper place, which was behind her, not in front of her. On the 4th of July, Dry Creek held its annual celebration in the town square, which consisted of a street dance, a shooting competition, a pie auction, and a considerable amount of whiskey. Maggie had not planned to go, but her nearest female neighbor, a practical and cheerful woman named Ruth Dawson who had been farming with her husband Pete 20 miles north, came by in the morning to collect her, because Ruth had decided that Maggie Hawthorne had been working alone long enough and needed to meet some people. Ruth Dawson was 42 years old and had the personality of someone who had been quietly improving the world around her for so long that it had become entirely natural. She had arrived at Maggie's door with corn bread and a determination that was not to be argued with, and Maggie had found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not want to argue with it. They rode into Dry Creek together in the Dawson wagon, Pete driving and the two women in the back with their feet hanging off the gate, and Maggie found herself glad to be there, glad of Ruth's company, glad of the sound of the fiddle that reached them while they were still a quarter-mile from town. Clark was already there when they arrived. She saw him near the edge of the dancing square, standing with a man she did not know, both of them watching the fiddler. He had cleaned up for the occasion, she noticed, and the noticing sent a small, warm current through her. He had on a good shirt, dark blue, and his boots were clean and his hat was brushed. He looked like himself, only arranged a little more deliberately than usual, and she was about to look away when he turned as if pulled and found her across the square without any apparent searching, as if he had simply known where she was. He excused himself from the man he was talking to and walked across the square to her, and she thought, there, that is what it is. The way he came directly toward her, not circling, not casual, just decided. That was what it was. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Mr. Shelby," she said. Ruth Dawson, beside her, was very ostentatiously looking at the fiddler. "I was going to ride out and see if you were coming," he said. "Ruth convinced me," she said. He looked at Ruth, who was still studying the fiddler with enormous interest. "Thank you, Mrs. Dawson," he said, and Ruth turned with a smile that contained several things she was politely not saying. "Oh, any time," said Ruth. "Pete, darling, come see the fiddler," she said, taking her husband's arm and drawing him away with the efficiency of a woman clearing space, and then it was just Clark and Maggie standing together in the festive noise of the 4th of July with the fiddle playing and the late afternoon light turning everything gold and a little burnished. "You want to dance," he said. "I thought you'd ask that more nervously," she said. He gave her a look. "I'm nervous," he said. "I'm just not going to do it awkwardly," she laughed, and the laugh surprised her with how easy it was. "Yes," she said, "I want to dance." He was a good dancer. Not showy but confident, because he had been to enough dances in his life to have figured out the mechanics, and he held her correctly, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers, and she was close enough to see the small pulse at his jaw and the way his eyes were doing what she had noticed they did when he was working through something, that focused inward attention. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because she was not afraid of asking things. He looked at her directly. "That I'd like to spend more time with you than fence-line conversation," he said. "That I'd like to know you better," a pause, "and that I'm not entirely sure how to say that without it sounding like something different from what I mean." She studied his face. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean I respect what you're building out there," he said. "I know you came west to work your land and not to find a man. I've watched you work and I know that's the truth, and I don't want to complicate that." He turned with her through the step of the dance, and his voice was low and even. "I also find that I think about you a very great deal more than is strictly related to the fence line." The fiddle played on. Around them the whole town was noise and motion and firelight beginning to warm against the gathering dusk, and Maggie felt the fear she had noted and catalogued perform a small clean exit from the room of her chest, and what was left in its absence was clear and simple and true. "Clark," she said. "Yeah. I find the same," she said. "A very great deal more." He missed a step, just one. Then his hand at her waist pressed slightly firmer, just slightly, not insistent, just present, and she moved with it and they danced for a while without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. He walked her to Ruth's wagon at the end of the evening and stood in the dark while the town noise carried on behind them and the first stars were sharp and white overhead. She turned to say good night, and he was closer than she expected, just close, just the kind of close that happens at the end of good evenings, and his voice when he said her name was very quiet. Maggie. Yes. Can I call on you? Properly. He said it with a slight roughness, as if the word properly embarrassed him a little in that particular context. I know that sounds formal. It sounds right, she said. Yes, you can call on me. He smiled, and she had seen him laugh once and seen him almost smile several times, but this was a full, quiet smile, just for her, standing in the dark of the 4th of July, and she went home with it warm inside her like a coal in a stove. July turned serious with its heat, and the work of both their parcels intensified. Maggie's sorghum went in, the planting taking 3 long days that left her so tired she fell asleep at the table over her notebook each evening. But the seeds were in the ground, and the retention pool was holding, and the soil amendments were doing what she had planned them to do. She could feel the land changing under her work, the way a difficult thing changes when you understand it well enough. Clark came on Sunday afternoons. Not all afternoon, not imposingly, but he came, and she looked forward to his footsteps on the 2-step porch with something she had stopped trying to qualify. He usually brought something, a loaf of bread from the bakery in town, a newspaper, a book he thought she would find interesting. She always had coffee. They sat on her small porch in the heat of the afternoon and talked, and sometimes they walked her land because she wanted to show him how the sorghum was coming in, and he wanted to see it, genuinely, not as a courtesy. One Sunday in late July, he brought a book about irrigation in the American Southwest, a thick technical volume that he had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio 6 weeks prior, and that had finally arrived. He handed it to her, and she opened it and immediately started reading the table of contents with the focused hunger of someone who has been waiting for exactly this information. And he watched her from his chair with a look on his face that was so unguarded it lasted only a moment before he looked out at the landscape. "You ordered this for me," she said, not looking up from the table of contents. "I thought it might be useful," he said. "Clark, you ordered this 6 weeks ago." She looked up then, and his face was composed again, the quiet, serious face she knew, but his eyes were doing a thing she had learned to read, a warmth that he did not always put in the rest of his expression. 7 weeks, he said. 7 weeks ago, she said softly, you were ordering books for me. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. 7 weeks ago I was already fairly certain how I felt about you, he said. So yes. She set the book carefully in her lap and looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. The heat pressed down and the grass moved in a slow, hot wind, and somewhere a dove was calling its long, repetitive note over and over in the mesquite. "I love you," she said, simply, directly, without embellishment, which was the only way Maggie Hawthorne knew how to say true things. He did not look surprised. He had perhaps known just as she had known. But knowing and hearing are different things, and the thing that moved through his face when she said it was not surprise. It was relief, she thought. It was the look of a thing that has been carried a long time being set down. "I love you too," he said. "I have for a while," she nodded. He nodded. The dove called in the mesquite. Nothing about it was complicated. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just covered it with his broad, scarred hand over her smaller one. And they sat like that on the porch with the irrigation book in her lap and the hot July air around them and the sorghum coming up in the field. And it was one of the finest afternoons Maggie Hawthorne had ever lived. But nothing in West Texas stayed uncomplicated for long, and August announced itself with trouble. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Doyle Nesbitt, who owned a substantial amount of land to the northwest, and who had been, it emerged in the course of several conversations, operating under the assumption that the Hawthorne parcel was going to fail and revert to him, based on a debt arrangement he had apparently made with Clement Hawthorne in the final months of Clement's life. He arrived at Maggie's door on a Tuesday morning, riding a good horse and accompanied by a man who worked for him, with a piece of paper that he described as a lien against the parcel. Maggie took the paper from him and read it twice. She did not invite him inside. This purports to be a lien based on a loan of $40 made to Clement Hawthorne in August of 1873, she said when she had finished reading. That's right, said Nesbitt. He was a heavy-set man of about 50 with the self-assured manner of someone who had not been disagreed with effectively in some time. Your uncle borrowed $40 and put the land up as security. He never paid it back. The deed transferred to me free and clear through inheritance, Maggie said. A lien against my uncle's assets does not automatically encumber inherited property in this state without a court judgment. Nesbitt blinked. Now, miss. Furthermore, she continued, the document you are presenting me is not a recorded lien. It is a private promissory note. Whether it constitutes a valid claim against the parcel would require a judicial determination. You are welcome to make that determination at the county courthouse, where I will be glad to appear and present my position. Nesbitt looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected an entirely different conversation. You seem very certain of yourself, he said, and his voice had shifted into something less friendly. I am certain of the law, she said. I spent the winter reading it. Good morning, Mr. Nesbitt. She went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it until she heard the hoofbeats recede. Then she went to her writing case and sat down and wrote 3 letters, one to the county land recorder, one to the county judge, and one to a lawyer in Abilene she had identified in February as someone who handled land disputes, because she had read enough to know that being right and winning were different things, and that winning required representation. She told Clark that evening at the fence line. His jaw tightened when she described Nesbitt, and his eyes went to the middle distance in the way they did when he was controlling something. He tried this with a homesteader named Vasquez 2 years ago, Clark said. Same kind of note. Vasquez didn't know his rights. Nesbitt ended up with the land. I know my rights, Maggie said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I know you do. A pause. I want to go with you to the courthouse. I may need you as a witness, she said. You knew about the parcel boundaries and the condition of the land when I arrived. That might be relevant to establishing that I have made genuine improvements and have legitimate claim to continued possession. Maggie, he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had, direct and very personal. I want to go with you because I want to be there. That's the primary reason. She looked at him in the last of the evening light. All right, she said quietly. I'd like you to be there too. The hearing at the county courthouse in Comanche Wells 3 weeks later was not dramatic in the way of the novels that Maggie had read about the law. The judge was a tired man named Halloran who had seen a great many land disputes and had limited patience for what he called paper shenanigans. The Abilene lawyer, a sharp young man named Carruthers who wore city clothes and had a mind like a steel trap, appeared on Maggie's behalf. Nesbitt had an older local lawyer who was clearly accustomed to being the most prepared man in the room and was not prepared for Carruthers. The judge ruled in Maggie's favor. The promissory note was not a recorded lien. It was a personal debt of a deceased man, not an encumbrance on inherited property. The land was hers, unencumbered, as it had been from the day the deed transferred. Nesbitt looked at Maggie with a cold, flat anger as the hearing ended. Carruthers was already packing his papers. Clark was standing at the back of the courtroom, and when Maggie came out into the aisle and walked toward him, she watched his expression move from tense watchfulness to relief to something quieter and fuller. It's mine, she said when she reached him. Of course it is, he said. He put his hand briefly at the back of her arm as they walked out of the courthouse into the September morning, and it was such a small touch, light and fleeting, but she felt it all the way home. Nesbitt did not pursue the matter further, which Maggie attributed partly to the legal reality and partly to the fact that by October she had become visibly, undeniably something in Dry Creek. She was not just the woman on the Hawthorne parcel anymore. She was the woman who had built the retention pool, and the woman who had won a courthouse hearing, and the woman with the finest sorghum crop on the west side of the county, which people rode out from town to look at because it was the kind of crop you look at. Tall and dense and organized, the rows straight as intention. Ruth Dawson came out and walked the rows with her in October, and declared that Maggie Hawthorne was the most sensible person to arrive in this county in 10 years, which Maggie received with a laugh and real gratitude, because Ruth's opinion mattered to her enormously by then. "And what about that Clark Shelby?" said Ruth, walking a row with her hands clasped behind her back in the considering manner she had. "What about him?" said Maggie. "Maggie." Ruth. Ruth stopped walking and turned and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has raised several children and negotiated with the world for 42 years and is not going to accept evasion. "He looks at you like you hung the stars," Ruth said. "And you look at him like you are very carefully trying not to look at him, which amounts to the same thing." Maggie looked at her sorghum row. "We are," she said carefully, "in an understanding." "An understanding," Ruth repeated. "We love each other," Maggie said. "That is the understanding." Ruth made a sound of satisfaction. "Good," she said. "Now, has he asked you?" "Asked me what?" "Maggie Hawthorne, do not make me spell it out in a sorghum field." "No," Maggie said, and there was something in her voice she did not entirely manage to keep out. "He has not asked, and I am not waiting to be asked, Ruth. I want to be clear about that. I'm not living my life in suspension waiting for a question. I am building my land and living my days, and I am deeply happy with things as they are." Ruth looked at her kindly. "And yet," she said. "And yet," Maggie agreed very quietly. The evening after that conversation, which Maggie had not mentioned to Clark, and did not intend to mention, Clark arrived at her door on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was the look of a man who has been thinking hard about something for a long time, and has finally arrived at the place he was thinking toward. She opened the door and looked at him, and knew immediately, in the way you know things about people when you have been paying close attention to them. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the center of her small one-room house, which she had made into a real living space by then, with a proper cook-stove and a table she had built herself and bookshelves with good books and curtains that Ruth had helped her sew. He looked around it with the same attention he gave to land and water and everything real, and then he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to ask you to let me get through it before you respond." "All right," she said, and sat down at the table, which seemed like the thing to do. He did not pace and he did not fidget. He stood and looked at her with his whole self directed at her, the way he had been since the morning he got off his horse at the fence line. "I've thought a great deal about how to say this in a way that is honest about all of what it is," he said, "because there are several things in it and I want you to know all of them." He took a breath. "I have watched you work this land since the day you came. I have watched you plan it and fight for it and build it and grow it. And there is nothing about the way you do what you do that is anything less than extraordinary. Not because you are a woman doing it, though people seem to think that should be the extraordinary part, but because of the person you are. You are the most intelligent person I have ever had a conversation with. You are the most capable person I have ever worked beside. And you are the person I want to have beside me every day for the rest of my life." He paused. Then he said the rest of it and said it plainly, because he did not do things any other way. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not to come work my land while I work it. Not to live beside me as a helper or a companion or a supplementary thing. I mean as my equal in everything. In work and in decisions and in how we build what we are going to build together. My land and your land are land. Your plans and my plans are plans. I don't know any other way to do it, and I don't want any other way. So I am asking if you will marry me on those terms, those exact terms." The silence after that was not long, but it had weight. "Clark," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. He waited. His hat was still in his hands. "I told you once that I would work the land beside you as an equal," she said. "You said it once at the fence line in June," he said. I remember exactly. And you said that was the only way you knew, she said. It is, he said. It's the only way I know. She stood up from the table and crossed to him in the 3 steps the small room allowed, and she took the hat out of his hands and set it on the table, and then she looked up at him from quite close, close enough to see everything in his face that was usually kept quiet, all of it present now, all of it directed at her. Yes, she said. Yes to every part of it. Yes to all of it. He put his hands at her face with the same careful steadiness with which he did everything, cupped her jaw with those broad, careful hands, and kissed her, and it was nothing like the heroic kisses in the novels she had read. It was better than that. It was just true. It was the two of them entirely present with each other in a small house in West Texas in October, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the wind in the grass outside, and it was the realest thing she had ever felt. They were married in November, on a Saturday, in the small whitewashed church in Dry Creek that held about 40 people and that day held about 60. The extra 20 standing along the walls because Ruth Dawson had told everyone she knew, and everyone she knew had told everyone they knew. The preacher was a weathered man named Brother Aldous, who had been marrying people in Dry Creek for 15 years, and who, Maggie privately thought, seemed genuinely moved by the occasion in the way that people are moved when they can see clearly that a thing is right. Maggie wore a dress that she and Ruth had made together over 3 evenings, ivory wool with small pearl buttons, and she had done her copper hair up in a way that was practical enough to come undone only once during the ceremony, which she felt was a reasonable performance for something she had assembled herself. Clark stood at the front of the church in a good dark suit that fit him like it had been made for him and probably had, his hands at his sides, and when she came up the aisle he looked at her with a steadiness and an entirety of attention that made every other sound in the room seem to recede. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, when she reached him, before Brother Aldous had even started. "You look very good yourself," she said. Brother Aldous cleared his throat with a smile. The ceremony was short because they had both specifically requested that it be short, and the vows were the traditional ones with one addition that Maggie had written out and given to Brother Aldous the week before, which he read out when the time came in a measured voice. To work beside each other as equals in all things, to honor the other's judgment and labor as fully as one's own, and to build together what neither would build as well alone. Clark repeated it without hesitation and with perfect clarity, as if the words were not only easy to say but were a description of something that already existed. Ruth Dawson cried. Pete Dawson patted her hand helplessly. Several other people cried. Old Reuben Gates, who had been on the porch of Holly's store the day Maggie arrived, told the man next to him that he had known from the very first day that girl was going to amount to something, which was not entirely the truth but had enough truth in it that no one challenged it. After the wedding supper, which was held in the street with tables set end to end and food that half the county had contributed, and a fiddler who played until his arm gave out, Clark and Maggie drove home together to the Shelby parcel, which they had already decided would be the primary house because Clark's house was larger, while her house would serve as additional storage and workspace during the expansion of the farming operation she had already drawn plans for. They drove home in the dark under the enormous Texas sky, the stars dense and cold overhead, the horse moving at a patient walk because there was no hurry. She was leaning against him on the bench seat with his arm around her shoulders, and the whole world felt very clean and spacious, the way it feels when a thing you have been hoping for becomes a thing you have. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he had learned from her to ask that question. "I'm thinking about the North Field," she said. He laughed, the real laugh she had heard only a handful of times, startled and delighted. "On our wedding night." "I know," she said, laughing too. "I can't help it. I was reading about cover cropping last week and I have an idea about the North." "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened with his whole attention, the way he always did, asking real questions, offering what he knew about the soil on the north side, which he had worked for 3 years. By the time they reached home, They had the outline of a plan for a winter cover crop that would set up the north field for a strong sorghum yield the following year, and Maggie had it half mapped in her mind, and was resolved to put it on paper in the morning. She did not put it on paper in the morning. In the morning she lay still and listened to the sounds of someone else breathing beside her and looked at the ceiling of Clark's house, which was their house now, and felt a quiet so complete and full that it took her a while to recognize it as happiness. He was already awake, she realized, looking at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He reached over and tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear with one finger, very gently, and she turned her head on the pillow to look at him, and they stayed like that for a while in the early morning light of November before the day made its claim on them. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was one of the hardest the Pecos country had seen in a decade. The cold came down in earnest in December, and the ground froze in a way that this country, which was not accustomed to serious cold, seemed offended by. The cattle on the range suffered. 3 ranchers in the county lost significant portions of their herds to the cold and the shortage of winter forage. Clark lost 4 cattle to a blizzard in January that blew down from the north with no warning, and Maggie came home from checking on her chickens with her face white from the wind, and both of them spent 3 days barely leaving the house, keeping the stove banked high, and the livestock as protected as they could manage. But the cover crop Maggie had planted on the north field, the winter rye she had gone in on in November, came through the cold looking ragged but alive, and in February, when the worst of it broke, the rye was green and coming back, and the soil under it was far less frozen damaged than the unprotected ground on neighboring parcels. "Your winter rye," Clark said one February morning, standing at the field's edge in his coat with his breath misting. "It worked," she said from beside him. "It worked," he agreed. He looked at her sideways with a quieter version of the real laugh. "You are occasionally smug about being right." "I have earned it," she said. "You absolutely have," he said, and put his arm around her shoulders. The spring of 1875 opened like a gift. The rains came at the right time, and the sorghum went in on the best prepared ground Maggie had yet worked. The soil dark and responsive after the winter rye's root work and the amendments of the previous year. She had also begun a kitchen garden that by May was producing beans and squash and tomatoes in quantities that she preserved in glass jars on the shelves she and Clark had built along the north wall of the house, and the sight of those jars, filling up row by row through the summer, was one of the things she found privately beautiful. They worked together every day, and it was exactly what Clark had said on the day he asked her. Their plans, their decisions, their land. She would come to him with an irrigation question, and he would work through it with her, and add what he knew and defer to what she knew better. He would come to her with a question about the cattle grazing rotation, and she would look at his land maps and tell him what she thought, and he would do it, and it would work, or it would need adjustment, and they would adjust it together. There was no territory between them, no area where one of them was sovereign and the other a visitor. It was a full partnership, operating on 2 people's complete knowledge and judgment, and it produced results that their neighbors noticed. By the summer of 1875, the Shelby operation, as people in Dry Creek called it, was producing more per acre than almost any comparable spread in the county. Pete Dawson came out with his hat in his hand one July afternoon to ask Maggie about her soil amendment method, because he was watching her crop come in and wanted to understand it. She spent 2 hours walking him through her notebook with genuine pleasure, because she believed knowledge was for sharing, and because Pete Dawson was a good man and a good farmer. Clark watched from the porch drinking coffee, and when Maggie came back up to the house after walking Pete out to his horse, he had a look on his face that she had learned was his version of beaming. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just watching you teach someone who asked respectfully to be taught." She took his coffee cup from his hand and drank the last of it, which she had also been doing since February with a casual familiarity that still made him smile every time. "Go back to work," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it and went back to work. Maggie discovered she was pregnant in September of 1875, on a Tuesday morning when she was calculating seed orders, and suddenly had to sit down very quickly on the kitchen floor and wait for the world to stop moving sideways. She sat on the floor for about 5 minutes, doing arithmetic in her head of a different kind from the seed order arithmetic, and arrived at a conclusion that was simultaneously startling, and she realized as she sat there on the floor of the kitchen she had learned to love, deeply right. She told Clark that evening directly, as she told him everything. He had been coming in from the barn and stopped when he saw her face. She was sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of tea and a particular expression that he read immediately. "Something happened," he said. "Something is happening," she said. "We are going to have a baby." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he came to the table and sat down across from her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes that held everything clearly. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was what he asked first. "I am well," she said. "I am surprised, but I am well and I am glad." He exhaled, and in the exhale she could hear everything he had been holding since she said it. Then slowly, a smile that was different from any smile she had seen on him, not the almost smile of their early weeks and not the private warm smile of their personal moments, but something new, unguarded and full. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if testing the words. "We are," she said. He raised her hands to his mouth and kissed them, both of them, the knuckles, and she felt it in her chest, that warmth, pressing full against the inside of her ribs. "We will need to talk about the spring work plan," she said after a moment. He looked up at her from her hands with a kind of helpless adoration. "Of course," he said. "I intend to work through the spring," she said. "I am not going to become an invalid. I have read about it, and the common wisdom about women resting during normal healthy pregnancies is largely overabundant caution. Reasonable work through the first and into the second trimester is—" "Maggie," he said. "Yes." "I know you have read about it," he said, with the gentle directness that was entirely his. "I know you will determine for yourself what you can and cannot do, and I trust that determination entirely. I will not manage you or restrict you. What I want is for you to tell me when something is too much, not after but during, so I can be useful in the way you need rather than in the way I think you need." She looked at him across the table. Firelight from the stove. October beginning at the windows. His hands holding hers. "You are going to be an extraordinary father," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try very hard to be," he said. The pregnancy was, as Maggie had assessed, a healthy one. She worked through the winter with appropriate adjustments, and Clark adjusted his own work to cover what she could not do in the later months without announcement or discussion, simply appearing with a shovel where a shovel was needed, simply doing the thing that needed doing in the way that had always characterized him. She loved him for it, and she told him so regularly, because she believed in saying true things. Their son was born in June of 1876, delivered by Ruth Dawson and the Dry Creek midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Flores who had delivered half the babies in the county. Clark waited on the porch through the whole of it, not because he was sent out, but because Maggie had told him gently that she needed to be able to make noise without worrying about him, and he had understood that completely and gone out with his dignity intact. When Mrs. Flores opened the door and told him it was done and everyone was well, he stood up from the porch step where he had been sitting with his head in his hands and went inside and found Maggie on the bed with a small wrapped person in the crook of her arm, tired in the bones, deep way of someone who has done something enormous, and looking at what she had done with the expression of complete and wondering attention. Clark sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and resolute-looking, which he felt was fitting. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly. "He looks angry," Maggie said, with the particular fond, amused tone of the extremely tired. "He looks like someone who has just been through a very difficult experience," Clark said. "I think he's allowed." She laughed, which made the baby flinch and then settle. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. They had discussed names through the winter without settling. She had a list in her notebook. He had a few things he had thought about privately. "James," he said, "for my father, if that's all right with you." She looked at the baby, at James, and then at Clark. "James Shelby," she said. "Yes, that's right." He put his hand very carefully on the baby's head, that gentle touch, and stayed there, and Maggie watched his face go through things that had no words for them, that were entirely new, and she felt so much in that moment that it expanded beyond what any room could hold and went out through the walls and into the enormous sky. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, but with enough purpose and love and honest work, that the difficulties were things that happened within a life rather than things that defined it. The sorghum operation expanded through 1876 and 1877, with Maggie developing a seed selection process that improved yield consistency, and that she wrote up in a careful document and shared with several neighboring farmers, which led to her being invited to speak at a county agricultural meeting in 1877. An invitation that was extended with some hesitation by the organizing committee and received by the attendees with a range of reactions from interested to discomfited to actively impressed. She spoke for 20 minutes with her notes in one hand and her convictions in the other, and answered questions for another 40, and Clark sat in the second row with James on his knee, James being by then a mobile, inquisitive 14-month-old who was deeply interested in Clark's hat buttons, and Clark held him steady and watched Maggie speak, and had the look on his face that she had long since learned to read as his particular version of joy. The Nesbitt situation resolved itself in the way that such situations sometimes do, not through drama but through time. Nesbitt sold his northwest parcel in 1877 to a family named Cardenas who came up from San Antonio with 4 sons and a determination equal to Maggie's, and who proved to be excellent neighbors. Maria Cardenas became, over the following years, a genuine friend to Maggie in the way that Ruth Dawson was, a friendship built on respect and shared hard work, and the particular bond between women who have made something of themselves in a country that required everything you had. Ruth Dawson lost Pete in the winter of 1877 to a chest illness that took him in 3 weeks, and the grief of that loss came into their whole community like weather, widespread and real. Maggie and Clark were at the Dawson farm regularly through the winter, Clark taking on the heavy work that Pete had done, while Maggie sat with Ruth in the evenings and let her talk and cry and be fully whatever she needed to be without being managed through it. Ruth came through the winter and through the spring, and by the summer was farming with her eldest son, who had come west from Missouri to help her, and she was different after Pete's death, quieter in some ways and more distilled in others, but still fundamentally herself, still the woman who could read a situation at a glance and act on it without hesitation. In the spring of 1878, Maggie began building the irrigation expansion she had been designing in pieces since 1874. It was the most ambitious thing she had attempted. A gravity-fed channel from the retention pool to the eastern flat of the now combined Shelby parcel, with secondary feeder lines to the kitchen garden and the cover crop rotation fields. She hired 2 laborers from town for the heavy digging, and she and Clark worked alongside them, the 4 of them in the trenches through April and May, and James, who was nearly 2, followed them along the surface edge with a toy shovel and an entirely serious expression that made all 4 adults fight laughter every time they looked at him. "He is going to be an engineer," Maggie said one afternoon, watching James pack dirt with his toy shovel with focused determination. "He is going to be a farmer," Clark said. "Look at how he studies the grade." "Both," she said. "Both," he agreed. The irrigation channel was completed in May, and the first time the water ran through it, following the grade she had carefully calculated, moving along the channel from the retention pool, and fanning out into the feeder lines. Maggie stood at the source point and watched the water move with a feeling that was too big and too old for the ordinary words she had for it. This was something she had imagined in Fort Worth in the winter of 1873, bent over borrowed books by lamplight, and here it was, moving through the ground she had made. Clark came and stood beside her without saying anything. He had learned over the years which moments wanted words and which ones did not. This one did not. He simply stood with her, and she put her hand through his arm, and they watched the water run. Their daughter arrived in August of 1879, on a hot, still night that finally broke with a thunderstorm in the small hours. She came fast, as if she had been waiting for long enough, and arrived with a shout rather than a cry, which Mrs. Flores said with considerable satisfaction was a good sign. They called her Clara Ruth, the second name for Ruth Dawson, who wept openly when she heard it, and then recovered and declared that any girl named partly after her had better have some spine, which seemed unlikely to be a problem given her parentage. James, who was 3, regarded his sister with profound suspicion for about a week, and then became her most devoted protector, a relationship that persisted as both children grew and that Maggie found privately one of the most satisfying things she had ever observed. The land by 1880 was something to be seen. 6 years of careful work, of soil amendment and water management and thoughtful crop rotation, had transformed what had been 40 acres of hardpan and an adjacent cattle parcel into something that hummed with life and productivity. The retention pool had been expanded twice and now served as the source for the full irrigation system. The sorghum yield was consistent and strong. The cattle herd was smaller than some neighboring ranches, but healthier, better managed, with a lower loss rate through hard winters. The house had been expanded 3 times, a bedroom added when James came and then expanded further when Clara arrived, and a proper study where Maggie kept her notebooks and her books, and where she worked in the evenings on the plans and records that kept the operation running with the precision she had always brought to it. On a Sunday evening in October of 1880, Maggie sat on the porch in the cooling air with Clark beside her, James asleep inside, and Clara sitting on the porch boards between them, playing with a collection of rocks she had curated from the creek bed, and arranged by some principle that was entirely her own. The sky was doing the thing it did in October in West Texas, going through all the colors it had been saving up, gold and amber and a deep burning orange along the mesa tops. "Do you remember the day I arrived?" Maggie said. "Yes," Clark said. He said it simply, without elaboration, which meant he remembered it completely. "I had $40 and a battered deed and no one who knew my name within 500 miles, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "Terribly," she said. "I was frightened every single day for the first month. I just didn't let it sit in the front of me." He turned his head to look at her, and his face had that quality that was still, after 6 years, capable of moving her, that quiet entirety of regard. "You never showed it," he said. "I showed it to you," she said. "Eventually. Not for a long time." "No," she agreed. "Not for a long time." She looked at the mesa colors fading into blue. "You made it safe, too." He reached over and took her hand in the easy way that long familiarity brings to things, not dramatic, just certain. "Mama," said Clara from the porch boards, holding up a rock with the gravity of a person making an important presentation, "this one is the best one." "I can see that," Maggie said. "It's an excellent rock." "It is," Clark confirmed seriously, leaning to look at it. "Where did you find it?" Clara launched into a detailed account of the rock's origins and relevant qualities, and her parents listened with the whole of their attention, and the evening settled around them golden and complete. A letter arrived in the spring of 1881 from Maggie's old seamstress employer in Fort Worth, who had somehow heard about the Shelby farm operation, and written to ask if Maggie would be willing to correspond with a young woman the employer knew, a girl of 22 who had recently inherited a parcel in the hill country and did not know where to begin. Maggie wrote back the same day, a long practical letter full of everything she had learned, and followed it with more letters over the following weeks. And when the young woman, whose name was Frances, wrote back with questions that were smart and specific and showed real understanding, Maggie felt a particular pleasure that she recognized as the pleasure of passing something on. "You should write it all down," Clark said when she told him. "Everything you know about this land and soil and water, not just letters. A proper record. I have notebooks full," she said. "Organize them," he said, "into something someone could read and use. You could help a great many people." She looked at him. He meant it entirely. He always meant what he said entirely. She began organizing the notebooks that winter, working in the evenings after the children were in bed, and Clark often sat across the table from her working on his own accounts while she worked, two people at a table with lamplight between them, and she thought sometimes about the woman she had been in Fort Worth reading borrowed books by lamplight, and felt enormous tenderness for her, for everything that woman had not known was coming. By the summer of 1881, James could ride. He had taken to it the way some children take to water, with an immediate natural ease that came not from teaching, but from some prior understanding of the relationship between a person and a horse. Clark taught him on a small patient mare named Biscuit, walking beside him in the corral for the first few sessions, and then stepping back and watching with his hands in his pockets and the quiet look of a man witnessing something good. Maggie watched from the fence rail with Clara on her hip, and James went around the corral with perfect small seriousness, reins correct, back straight, and then looked over at his parents with a pride so enormous it barely fit on his 5-year-old face. Clara would be next, they both knew. Clara was a person of opinions, and she had already informed them both that she intended to ride Biscuit too, soon, which was a request that was going to be granted without debate. Life had a shape to it by then, the shape that comes from enough years of chosen things piling up into something solid and permanent. The land was known. The work was understood. The children were growing with a confidence that came from two parents who had never once treated either of them as lesser than their full capacity. James already helped with the lighter farm tasks with genuine pride of ownership. Clara already had opinions about irrigation, largely uninformed but delivered with such conviction that Maggie and Clark had learned to receive them with the same seriousness they gave to each other, because that was the kind of household they were going to be. In the fall of 1881, something happened that surprised both of them, or rather that surprised Maggie and that Clark, when told, received with the quietness of someone who had half expected it. The County Agricultural Board wrote to ask if Maggie Shelby would be willing to serve as a technical advisor for a new county farming extension program that was being developed in partnership with the Texas State Land Office. The program was intended to help homesteaders in the Pecos region develop sustainable farming practices. They had, the letter said, received her name from several sources, including the county judge who had ruled on the Nesbitt matter 7 years earlier and who had apparently been watching the Shelby operation with appreciation ever since. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again and set it down. "Clark," she said. He was by the stove. He came and read it over her shoulder. "Well," he said, "I am trying to determine how I feel about it," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She thought for a moment. "Like it is a very large thing," she said. "Like it is the kind of thing that comes from everything I have done and asks me to extend it further than I planned." She looked up at him. "What do you think?" "I think you should do it," he said. "I think you have always been working towards something larger than our 40 acres, even when the 40 acres were the whole thing. I think you want to do it and are asking me because you believe in deciding together, and because you want to know what the effect on the farm will be." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "all of that exactly. The effect on the farm," he said, "is that you will work somewhat fewer hours on it and I will work somewhat more, which is entirely manageable. And the farm will benefit, I suspect, from you being constantly in contact with the latest thinking about regional agriculture." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Do you know what you are?" "What?" he said. "You are exactly what I needed, and I did not know it was possible," she said. "I thought I might have to choose between a man and the full use of myself. I did not know it was possible for them to be the same thing." He sat down beside her at the table and took her face in his hands, those broad, careful hands she had loved since before she knew she loved them. "I need the full use of you," he said. "That's who I fell in love with. Why would I want less?" She kissed him, there in the kitchen with the fall light coming through the window and the sound of the children playing outside. And it was still, after everything, exactly what she needed it to be. The extension program began in the spring of 1882, and Maggie threw herself into it with the same organized intensity she had brought to every problem she had chosen to solve. She traveled to neighboring counties twice a month, riding the routes she had learned, meeting homesteaders in their fields and their kitchens, walking their land with the same attention she had always given to her own. And the combination of her technical knowledge and her plain-spoken directness proved to be exactly what the program needed. People trusted her because she knew what she was talking about, and because she did not talk down to them, because she remembered what it was to stand in a field that you did not yet understand and feel the weight of all you had to learn. Clark managed the farm operation during her travel days with James, now 6, shadowing him as an earnest assistant, and Clara, now 2, managing to insert herself wherever there was something interesting happening, which was everywhere. "She tried to help me with the irrigation valve this morning," Clark told Maggie on a Tuesday when she came home from 3 days in Lampasas County. He had the particular tone of someone reporting a miracle. "Did she open it?" "She could not reach," he said. But the intention was absolutely there. "She'll reach in a year," Maggie said. "I know," he said. "I'm planning ahead." Maggie laughed and picked up Clara, who had come running to the door with a rock, a different excellent rock, and held her tight for a moment, breathing in the smell of her hair that was like grass and sun and the particular sweetness of small children, and felt the weight of the days she had been away settle and lift simultaneously. She was good at the traveling work and she was good at the coming home, and she had both because of the man she had married, and she knew it clearly and was grateful for it in the straightforward way that she was grateful for true things. In the summer of 1883, they planted an orchard. It had been in Maggie's plan since 1875, but had been deferred year by year for the more urgent work. And now the irrigation system was reliable enough, and the soil improvement sufficient that she judged the time was right. They put in 20 apple trees and 12 peach trees along the northern edge of the property, where the irrigation line ran, and the wind shelter from the mesquite trees to the south created a protected microclimate. Clark and James dug the holes while Maggie and Clara set the young trees, and it was an entire day's project that ended with all 4 of them tired and dirty and satisfied, sitting on the porch in the long evening eating cold cornbread and looking at what they had planted. "They will not produce for 3 years," Maggie said. 4 for the apples," Clark said. 4, she agreed. "But in 10 years this will be producing more fruit than we can use, and we will be able to sell the surplus." James, who was 7, was looking at the young trees with his father's serious expression. "How do you know they'll survive?" he asked. "The soil preparation and the water access give them the best chance we can give them," Maggie told him, taking him seriously as she always did. "We can't guarantee it, but we have done everything we know how to do, so we give them the best odds we can." He considered this with his full small attention. And then, she said, "you trust the work." He nodded slowly, processing that. Clark looked at her with a quiet smile. "You trust the work," Clark repeated softly. "I learned it from you," she said. He shook his head. "You knew it before you met me," he said. "You came out here with nothing but trust in the work." She thought about that. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe we each had half of it." "Maybe," he agreed. The orchard survived its first Texas summer, which was nothing short of remarkable, and survived its first winter, which was less surprising given that apples are more cold-tolerant. And by the spring of 1884, every tree was showing new growth, and the first hopeful blossoms were visible on the peach trees. Maggie wrote about the orchard establishment in one of her notebooks that was now being circulated, copied and recopied by extension program participants. The document Clark had told her to write, and that she had finally organized in the winter of 1881 into something structured and useful. The year 1884 brought them something else too, something none of them had expected. Her name was Lucy, the new baby, arriving in November to the profound interest of 5-year-old Clara and the careful, deliberate welcomeness of 8-year-old James, who announced to his sister within the first hour that he was going to teach Lucy to ride when she was old enough, just as he had been taught. Clark held the newest Shelby on the evening she arrived and stood by the window in the soft lamplight with her in his arms, and Maggie watched from the bed and thought about all the distance from that tent in the creek bed in 1874 to here. This room, this family, this man with his large, careful hands holding their newest child. 3, said Clark quietly to the baby. 3, Maggie confirmed from the bed. Are you well? He turned to look at her with the same question he always asked first. Very well, she said. Come here. He came and sat with her, and they both looked at Lucy, who was entirely unimpressed by her circumstances, and showed it with the particular majesty of the very new. And Maggie leaned her head against Clark's shoulder, and felt the absolute completion of a life that had been made by choice and work, and love in equal, honest measure. Outside the window, the West Texas night was enormous and cold and brilliant with stars, the way it had been every night since she came here, the sky unchanged by everything they had built under it. The same sky she had looked at from her tent in the spring of 1874, wondering what she was doing and knowing exactly what she was doing. The same sky that had arched over the 4th of July dance and the courthouse in Comanche Wells and the fence line where she had first set out, loud to Clark Shelby that she would work this land beside him as an equal. And he had said, with that quiet directness that was entirely him, that that was the only way he knew. She had believed him, and she had been right to believe him, and the belief and the rightness of it were all around her now in the form of everything they had built, the land and the water and the crops and the orchard and the children and the life they were still very much in the middle of living. She pressed a little closer to him. He tightened his arm around her slightly. Lucy slept. Clark, she said, yeah, I am glad I came west. She felt him smile against the top of her head. I am glad you came west too, he said. I am glad every single day. The peach trees bloomed the following April, white blossoms opening against the blue Texas sky, and the year after that they bore fruit, pale gold peaches with a sweetness that Maggie said was the taste of something earned, and Clark said that was exactly right, and James and Clara ate them standing in the orchard with the juice running down their hands, and Lucy, who was barely 2 and unstable on her feet, sat in the grass underneath one of the trees and looked up at the white blossoms still holding on against the April sky with an expression of pure attending wonder. Maggie picked one more peach from the nearest branch and brought it to Clark where he stood at the orchard's edge, and he bit into it and looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them was everything. The land they had made, the water they had brought, the children they had raised, the years of honest equal work, the years of honest equal love. Well, she said. Indeed, he said, which was the word old Reuben Gates had used, that first day on the porch, watching her walk away and not knowing at all what he was watching walk into the world. She laughed, remembering it, and he raised his eyebrows in the questioning way she had loved for years, and she took his hand and told him, and he laughed too, and it was real and unguarded and entirely there, out in the open, under the enormous West Texas sky.